In this episode, I am joined by John Maki Evans, teacher of Japanese swordsmanship, practitioner of several syncretic, esoteric Japanese disciplines of tantra and magic, and author of Kurikara, The Sword and the Serpent. John recalls aspects of his intense training in Japan, traces his lifetime spent uncovering the higher esoteric dimensions of the Japanese arts, and details the 9-stage journey from novice to master. John maps the subtle body and its correspondences to the 5 elements and the Dragon King protectors known as nāgarāja, explains the demands of following the inner path of transformation, and considers the special role of the sword in religious life. John also reflects on the process of opening the body and mind, recovery from severe back and brain injuries, and on the dangers of reaching your spiritual goals. So without further ado, John Maki Evans.
So when I was training with Fushi, the guy I mentioned in the introduction, so quite early on, he gave me 3 Gyoja names, 3 practitioner names, in the order that you do them in English. So John Maki Evans, and the first becomes in Japanese Ji-on, which is the sound of the ear. In other words, that was, I'm a good student, I listen. And then the second was Maki, which means straight tree. So straight growing. And then Ebanz, which means wide, benevolent forehead. So when I wrote the book, I thought, well, why don't I just the only way I can kind of indicate that something of that is I could spell the names in that way. So I spelt my middle name as if from transliterated from the Japanese. That's the story on that. What was interesting is how much the guy could see in terms of the stages. It was very, very interesting.
Can you say more about that?
Well, there were a couple of other people who visited him while I was there, who were English people. And one of them has become a really famous artist, working with natural. I think she'd be happy to say Susan Durgis is her name. She had she's had an exhibition at the Tate Modern. And she was doing kind of like conceptual stuff, and he said, you should work more with nature. And his way of kind of switching her into that was to get her to do some work with bamboo, but bamboo roots. And first she had to dig up the roots. This took about 3 days. So it kind of really dragged her right down into the earth. And that became her, that's set her life journey as an artist. And then somebody else who's now very famous, working with sound and family constellations. And she was doing quite different things at the time. And he just, I know he had that ability to kind of see very, very quickly what people's talents were and how that might evolve. Yeah.
And how did your names match what would become of your life?
Well, I mean, I think as a student, I didn't really have many talents. I wasn't physically very gifted. And intellectually, a bit kind of turgid, a bit sort of slowly. Like I had a tutor. He's a good friend of mine now, and he was convinced I was going to get a first at Oxford, because we really used to enjoy we used to really enjoy talking to each other. But my sort of intellectual rate of going through things, and especially sort of regurgitating stuff, slow. Let's put it this way, slow. Even at primary school, I remember being given that kind of muted compliment. But I think, yeah, I had that ability to really pay attention and to try and get something, be open to it in a way which is not you, which, you know, there are a lot of Japanese people like that. But people from this side of the world, or European and North Americans, tend not to have that sort of capacity. So I kind of reckon I've over the years I've recognized that. Maki, I mean, you could also say uptight. So that was pretty much puritanical uptight. That would be the other side of Maki, and that's definitely where I was coming from. Everything has its advantages and disadvantages. So if you're I don't know what's the word, what the word would be. Like an honest John type. I am an honest John type. This, in a way, protects you from certain things. So in a way, it's kind of protected my energy. I compare it to somebody like my friend and mentor, Shandor. And he said, all my horses went wild, went out of the stable, and you've been keeping yours carefully in the stable for many years. And that gives you an advantage in some ways, but on the other hand, there are many things that you miss out on, or where you've not responded to things because you were too closed off. So I see that in the kind of Maki. And then the Ebanzu part is, what's happening now, which is opening up at this advanced age.
Opening up to what? Can you talk a little bit about that process of opening up that you've been noticing?
Well, opening up in the body, for one thing, in a way I really wouldn't have. If I'd been thinking, when I went to Japan, and I was 28, and I started really getting into the martial arts 30, 31. And I'm thinking, I'm training with people who've been, for example, Japanese guys who've been doing kendo since they were 8. And thinking, it's a bit late, I'm halfway through my 30s, well, a couple of years long. And feeling that, have I got time to really explore this? And when I look back at that now, it's just, laughable, because so many things have come on much, much later. And the same on the outside, because, if you're opening up on the inside, you open to the outside. So in terms of, my teaching and students, yeah.
What do you mean opening up on the inside? Do you mean in terms of spiritual or energetic cultivation, that sort of thing? And what's, it seems to surprise you, this opening?
Well, people talk about things, like I get that with students. You get students who say they want this to happen, and then finally it happens, and then they're hugely kind of ecstatic about it, and that's the last you see of them.
Really?
That's happened a few times, yeah. Because, the last thing that people really want mostly is for the thing that they talk about to actually happen, because it's fine to think about it as a kind of a concept or a picture or a kind of emotional, a little hopeful bubble. But when you actually enter that, everything has to change. So then there's a huge amount of, well, it's painful because there's resistance. So all the parts of you that resist have to go through a kind of, maybe this is over kind of playing it a bit, but a bit like a kind of grieving process. And so there's a grieving process, and there's also a period of kind of numbness where, you know, some part of you's been working and it's done a job for you, but if you're going to move into this bigger sphere, it has to stop operating. So then it's kind of, it has to die, and then there's a period after the death where the new thing hasn't opened up properly, so you feel kind of lost. So I have this kind of grading system. I teach two styles. So one style is the Batoro, the Japanese swordsmanship taught by my master, who died almost 20 years ago. And then I have a system which is based loosely on what I was taught by the Yamabushi teacher, which is kind of based in Mikkyo, in Vajrayana Buddhism and the mountain ascetic tradition. And so people who are, and they grade in both. You're going through the black belt system. And, you know, as long as you're reasonably competent in the Japanese system, in the Nakamura, you know, you do it for a couple of years, you get Shodan, you do it another couple of years, and so on, and so on, and so on. But in the Kurikara, when you get to the end of the Shoden period, so in the old school martial arts, rather than the Dan grades, they had 3 levels of transmission. Shoden, so Sho means beginning, Den means transmission, first transmission, Chuden, which means middle transmission, and then Okuden, which means deep transmission. So in those 3, I've got three layers in each. So you have the first dan, second dan, third dan within the first transmission, and this is to do with the elements earth, water, fire. So earth is to do with grounding, water is to do with fluidity, adaptability, and then fire is to do with explosiveness, but also the increasing of the internal heat and learning to communicate with somebody else through that. So in partner forms, we do a kind of a bit like push hands, but with the swords. And I've had 10 students or 9 students now over the last 20 years got to that point. And although you're working in a way which involves the body, the mind, the emotions, the energy, everything else, it is largely in the physical sphere. Then in the Chuden, you enter into air, and that's to do with the mental system and your conditioning. And it means that you then have to start stepping out of the kind of vehicle you've built and begin to confront it. So I give it the name confrontation. But you confront it not in a way of aggression or hysteria, but in the same way that in the third stage, where you do this sticky swords practice, you learn to connect to the other person through the energy, the ki. So then if you're able to do that with somebody else outside, then you turn in and you look on your shadow and you start to work like that with yourself. But this is a whole different kind of level of commitment. And so far, I've only had one student who's kind of entered that. And the point I was going to make is, 5 years ago, I was trying to push people, if only you would lose all this much weight, or if only you could stop using your intellect in this way, or if you could only face up to these experiences you had as a child or when you were in the armed forces or whatever. But if the last thing you want as a teacher is to push somebody into a place that they're not really prepared to cope with. So, I realized that for this stage, it has to be something that comes from them.
And what makes that stage, that Chuden stage, so much more of a commitment?
Well, as I said earlier, because of the kind of the difficulties of confronting that and then learning to allow parts of yourself to die, if you want to put it that way. Because it will change lots of things about you. Another thing is, if people are in a relationships, which of course everybody's in all kinds of relationships, that can make a big difference. So if your partner, if you start to change like that, then that's also hugely challenging for your partner, especially if you're not very good at handling it. So there's lots of things to consider. And I think it's part of opening up is to allow people to find their own way in their own time, to be available. But I think when people, it's a completely different kind of teaching to the Shoden, completely different kind. And if anybody ever got through to the Okuden, if I'm still around, I'm sure that would be quite different again. So in the book, you mentioned wanting to talk about the elements. So there are 5 elements, but there are 9 stages. And in Shingon, which is the Vajrayana Buddhism of Japan, they're seen sometimes as, so you've got the earth, water. So this is these are the stages of the shugyo, of the progression, the sadhana. You've got the earth, water, fire, air, space. So space is the 5th here, but it's in the center of the mandala. And space represents Dainichi Nyorai, the great Sun Buddha in Vajrayana, which is the kind of the overarching principle represented in our mandala by the deity of Fudo Myo, who is the unmoving mantra king. Anyway, it's all by the by. So space. Then as you move through that, you go in reverse. It's like a mirror. So from space, it's air, fire, water, and then the final stage is back into the earth. So again, you're grounding. And there is a practice called the Kujiho, the practice of the 9 syllables, 9 shouts, 9 mantras, now 9 mudras. And that's a description of that journey. So, you know, the Dan grades or the rankings in the Kurikara ryu that I teach at the school are going through that process. So the idea being that when you get to 5th Dan, in the middle, you should be capable of spontaneous action with the sword. What my teacher called jiu jizai. So jiu means free and jizai means free, but the freedom is in 2 ways. So you free the observing principle is free, so you're seeing everything, and you're able to act in any way freely, appropriately, spontaneously. So, I mean, that's a pretty good place to get to if you can manage it. And the journey from that point then is having been able to manifest that through in the world of action with the sword, is then that becomes internalized into the Kurikara or the Kundalini practice. Yeah. So whether I'll ever get a student to teach that to, who knows? But
so for that second half, final 4 stages, does that still involve the sword, or are other practices done at that point?
Well, it's a question I've asked myself a few times, because about 5 years ago, I considered I had problems with my shoulders for so long. Well, all over the body, of course. I mean, this is the same story with anybody like me who's been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. But the particular set of physical problems, which meant it was very hard for me to use the sword very much at all. So I thought, you know, maybe this is a sign, time to, you know, give up the school, move to the Black Mountains and get a hut, you know, whatever. But the message kept coming back. No. And since then, the sword has become, you know, the thing about the sword is, I was thinking there's a lot about this when I was listening to some of the guys talking about, you know, the internal arts and the Chinese martial arts systems. The thing about the sword is that I described it in the book, you know, when you first get hold of the sword, it's like this completely alien object. And then slowly over time, it becomes a way of exploring deep in, I mean, I put it much better than that, deep inside yourself. And also, as you express with it, it tells you, you know, how much you can do with the sword is an indication of it's a kind of corrective, if you like. It's a corrective. I remember I was doing a demonstration once at some big Japanese fair, and I'd had some sort of experience in meditation, and I got this feeling that kind of a certain kind of feeling of benevolence and good feeling inside, and I was trying to work with that, and I stabbed myself. And I thought, yeah, okay, So the sword is a way of it's a corrective. It's like a musical instrument. And it can do anything to the degree to which you're able to go with it. So in a sense, the sword is actually a living thing. There's this famous saying in Japanese about the choice is the satsujin ken or the katsujin ken. So ken means a sword. Jin means a human being. Katsu means to bring to life, and satsu means to murder. So you've got the murdering sword, or you've got the life-giving sword. And my teacher was a genuine, my Japanese sword teacher, Nakamura Sensei, was the epitome of this, because he was in the Japanese army in the Pacific War. He was in the Japanese army in Manchuria, in a sort of special forces regiment where they used to attack with swords. Well, the NCOs and the officers with swords, they just charge in, and just the sheer intimidation was enough to terrify the opposition. And he'd had that experience. And later in the war, because of his particular depth of skill, he was seconded to do more training. But his closest, fellow instructors were all, many of them then became the people who did the executions with the sword. So at the end of the war, I think his immediate superior and some of his best friends were all, I don't know, hung or shot or whatever they did with them at the end of the war. But because he had that special skill and devotion to the sword, he was saved. He lived. And that was what drove him to teach. And that was what drove him to teach in a way where the sword was being used to bring people fully alive, not just to teach them a kind of murderous fantasy. Because when you're learning to fight with a sword, you're not learning for street combat. There's definitely something else going on, because that's just not an option. Yeah. So that's what the sword has, the capacity to do that. And like say in the last couple of weeks, I had a moment where something quite sort of new happened, where I was able to move in a way I've not been able to move before, a kind of freedom with the sword. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I, as I mentioned in the book in the introduction, when Fushi gave me the sword and said, try this, and there was something that felt really, what's the word? I felt really at home with it in a way, but I really didn't want to do it, because I thought, I want to become religious. I went to Japan. I was going to do acupuncture, study meditation. I'd been conditioned by the monastery. I was in the head of the monastery that, you don't want to waste your time cultivating the physical body. So I kind of ran away. And then I'd had back problems from the age of 15 when I took all the school weight training equipment home. And the last thing the sports teacher said to me was, you're going to herniate a disc, you'll be sorry. Which he'd done he wore a corset all the time because he damaged his lower back weightlifting. So I duly took it home and herniated a disc. And so from the age of 15 to 45, really, that problem just kept coming back and back and back. Even when I was doing all this hard training, there'd be like a month a year where I'd be flat on the floor. What was the point of this one? Yeah. So it got to a stage where I thought I was going to be in a wheelchair. So I gave up the sword and left Japan, decided to be a yoga teacher or an Alexander teacher, tried to find all sorts kinds of things, to heal my back. And then I met Shandor at an Iyengar yoga teachers weekend in London. Who knows, Godfrey may have been there, I don't know. Anyway, for some reason, I got invited to have a coffee with him, with Jerry, who was in charge of the seminar, maybe the 2 or 3 of us. And he said to me, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing my beginners Iyengar yoga teaching. And he said, no, not that shit. What are you doing? And I said, I didn't know what he meant. And he thought I was, in the armed forces or martial arts or something. He spotted it. And I said, I used to do the sword in Japan. And his eyes lit up. And he said, okay, so we're going to Japan. You're going to introduce me to your sword teacher. And I said, no, but, I've got this really bad back problem. He said, no, I'll fix your back. Then we're going to see your sword teacher. So, I kind of got dragged back into it. So it's like I said earlier, you're always trying to escape from the thing that you want, that the thing that you say you want, that you dream about. There's always a part of you that's trying to run away from it. So I've tried running away from the sword many times, and each time I get pulled back. Yeah.
How did Shandor fix your back?
Well, he wouldn't put it this way, but intra-abdominal pressure. So if you learn the correct way to use the diaphragmatic breathing, it creates this protective pressure so that even if you've got quite a bad distortion or compression or scar tissue, it just opens things up and gives a kind of support that allows the body to be. So, it wasn't overnight. It's been a continuous process, but that was the major shift. Yeah.
You mentioned before that students want something and then it happens, and then often they leave at that point. What are the sorts of things that those students wanted to happen?
Well, I'll tell you the most amazing one. There was a woman who was coming to my classes. So I teach the conditioning part, which is a big part of the Kurikara use separate. It's a bit like Qigong, a mixture of Qigong and slow sword movements with heavy poles or short steel poles. And then later on, there's more coiling movements. And she was very repressed. And she came in one day and she was very, I don't know, I couldn't read her at all. anyway, she said that she'd suddenly discovered this huge kind of sexual being, and apparently her partner, he was over the moon with it, but she was kind of I don't know, it was very strange. It wasn't, I didn't really understand. I think she just found it too much to cope with. So that's one example. I mean, another example I can think of is somebody that had been very locked in physically, and then suddenly their body kind of unlocked. And as you know, I'm sure, this is very rare, you know, for this to happen. Usually it's kind of incremental, or 2 steps forwards, 1 step backwards. But they, you know, all I know is they were very delighted with it, and that was the last time I saw them. So I think it can be just too much for people to handle.
Is this 9-stage journey, is that material all within the Kurikara Ryu system, or have you drawn material from other systems? You mentioned the word Kundalini, for example, and one doesn't immediately associate that with the Japanese arts. At least I don't. I'm probably wrong about that.
Well, could the period of when the tantric schools were growing up in India, and those kinds of practices, so with the mudra, the mantra, the mandala, very internal practice with a few postures. And at that time, the practitioners, there were ones that were Shaivite, so we would call them Hindu. Not that that really means anything to an Indian person. It's just a kind of foreign term. Then there were the Buddhist practitioners. There were also Sufis, and they were all doing the same kinds of practices. And those practices were taken by the Vajrayana to Tibet, to China, and from China to Japan. So there is a continuity there. In terms of the actual kind of practices done, I think the people in Japan who were doing the strongest practices were the ones in the kind of Yamabushi, the Shugendo tradition. So they were kind of, well, for some time they were kind of free. Later on, the 2 main esoteric Buddhist schools kind of took over and took them under their wing, the Tendai school and the Shingon school. But for a long time, it was very open and kind of wild, and there were lots of different influences. So although, you know, most Japanese people would find it abhorrent to consider, things like Japanese sword making, the metalworking traditions, the shamanic traditions, and some of the internal martial arts traditions came from the Altai Mountains via Korea. I mean, it is slowly, there are more people beginning to recognize this. And the village that I've been going to for the last 10 years, is a place called Doragawa, and it's at the foot. Well, yeah, it's at the foot of the Omine, the Mount Omine, which is one of the 3 most important Shugendo centers in Japan, if not the most important one. And they describe themselves as the town of the Oni, of the demons. And when you look back into the tradition, it's because the ethnic makeup of that area was primarily people who'd come from outside Japan, who were kind of a bit darker, slightly bigger noses. You have this image of what's called the Tengu, who are these kind of goblin figures with wings and who hang out in the forested mountains and who impart esoteric knowledge to, well, notably to some very famous swordsmen over the centuries. But this is a symbolic representation of something that came from outside, that was, so when I first met Shandor, he said, he used to have this dream about his Hun ancestors, the Huns and the Mongols with their swords. And my immediate thought was, I'm interested in the Japanese sword, which is altogether more, I don't know how I would have seen it as being more spiritual or more refined. But over the years, it's become clearer and clearer that that's exactly where it came from. So in the same way, you had, the Silk Road, and the main, well, I don't know if it's the main, one of the main pathways was from India through China into Japan. So all that same knowledge is there. Some of it latent, extremely latent. But if you start digging, you start to find it. So when I left Fushi, I had as I explained in the book, he just taught me the 9 mudras. No, I was given no explanation about what they meant. And I just practiced them alongside the sword and some very simple kind of rituals. And then after about, as the years go by, and as I was also studying yoga and tantra, the significance of the elements and of those different stages and of the process, it slowly starts to unfold. And the last 10 years have been to do with what in India is called the nāgarājas. Have you heard of the nāgarājas? So the nāgarājas are the snake kings. And again, you've got a kind of similar thing going on here, because the Nagas are also a race of people in the north of India. Again, the same kind of ethnic area or roots, for this other stuff that came through Korea with they were mercenaries of the Chinese armies. But Buddhism took the Nāgarājas, the snake kings, and they became the eight very significant guardians of the Buddha's law, of the Dharma. And in Japan, they're called the Hachidai Ryū, which is exactly the same thing. but dragons, so they become dragons. And as I said in the book in 2011, it always seemed to me that the dragons represent a kind of not just energetic thing, but the way that the body works when the human body is most free and integrated and expressive, it works through these kind of spirals. And in Indian anatomy, for example, they just describe the body as having the arms. There's one suji, or one kind of not tendon, suji, a kind of sinew. There's one sinew that goes one way and another sinew that goes the other way. So I guess in modern day terms, in the kind of alternative medicine, what do they call them? That there's a very famous book of it with these lines of following through the connective tissue.
Yeah, fascial trains, I think it's called.
Yes. And so the dragons are ways of describing that kind of movement. And so, having found the mandala that goes with the kujiho, so I said this system of 9 syllables or 9 shouts and spells with the mantras and the mudras. There's one text which assigns a guardian to each of these 9. And these 9 guardians are the 5 mantra kings, which is Fudomyo in the middle, or Vidyarajas in Indian, in Sanskrit, Vidyarajas. And then the Shtenno, which are the 4 guardians of the directions, which is of Chinese origin. So north, south, east, west. So you've got these are the yang ones on the outside, and then you have the yin ones on the inside, which are these mantra kings. And then in the center, you have Fudomyo, this is the ether element, space element, which is both yang and yin because it's everything. And he's a manifestation of Dainichi Nyorai, which is this kind of core of the Dharmakaya, the body of the Dharma. And so I spent some time trying to locate these in the body, as the gates. So you've worked out there's 4 gates. So these would be on the back of the body, here, 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 here. And then you've got the yin ones, but which is which? And there was nothing, I couldn't find any Japanese sources, but in the Indian equivalent of Feng Shui, which is called the name has escapes me for the moment. Anyway, it's the system whereby all buildings are built or cities are designed according to the directions.
Vashtu, perhaps.
Vastu Purusha, yeah, Vastu Purusha. So the image of the Vastu Purusha is north, south, west, east. And then it all made sense. It all made sense. And then the last part is then that the dragons are the expressions of those in action. So then I had to work out which. Obviously, Kurikara is the one in the center because Kurikara is from Fudomyo. So is another way of looking at the Kundalini or the energy of the central channel. I met after I wrote the book. I was contacted by somebody called Sylvain Guintard. Have you heard of him?
No.
So his Japanese name is Kuban. And he was doing martial arts and ninjutsu, all sorts of things in Japan. And he started studying Shugendo, and he became a Shingon priest. And he did, you've heard of the mountain monks, the marathon monks.
Yes.
So he did the Shingon equivalent of that, which is he lived in a cave for a year. Was it a year? I can't quite remember, any long period. Every day he had to do a marathon through the mountain. And then he was living on this very, very simple diet, and he was doing this Milarepa type practice in the cave. He also did this while he was having ankylosing spondylitis. Have you heard of ankylosing spondylitis?
I haven't. Sounds terrible.
It is terrible. It's truly terrible.
What is it?
It's a kind of autoimmune disease, which is primarily in the skeletal system. It can come into the eyes as well. So what happens to your spine is it becomes very, very inflamed, and then it creates all this calcium and it fuses.
Gosh.
So he was living in this damp cave and going through all these pains in this center while doing this practice. And at the end of the practice, as with the marathon monks, they have to do a 9-day fast without water. So on the last day, they have to be helped to their feet to go to the well to have their first drink. So he'd done this practice. The guy who did the practice before him died because, as Sylvain pointed out, he unfortunately is a bit stupid. He didn't realize you have to do this because not having fluid is really the key, is really the major challenge. You have to do this in a place where there's moisture in the air. So he chose a very dry place, didn't make it. So he had this amazing experience, despite, who knows, partly because of the ankylosing spondylitis. Who knows? Anyway, he contacted me, and he told me about this place, this Doragawa, and he mentioned that it has a shrine, or it has a separate hall from the Honzon, which is where the main Buddhist deities are enshrined, to Hachidai Ryuo. So immediately my ears, here's a place where the 8 dragon kings are enshrined, and it has a waterfall training place, which is called the Dragon Spring. So, I couldn't wait to get there. And also the priest who runs it is a genuine, there aren't many of them, somebody who's really genuine. And I arrived, and then this village, it's this village of the demons. So I've been going back there every year for a while. I had 3 years, of course, we couldn't go because of COVID. But that kind of fitted, that gave me the last part of the mandala. So, which I attempt to teach my poor students, many of whom thought they're only coming to learn how to wave the Japanese sword around. The last part of the mandala, the dragons. So I have a practice in the squat. It's something that Shandor came across. He's continually going through these texts, finding more texts, so that chanting, one way to do the chanting best is not Padmasana, but to sit in the squat, if you can, with the feet together, knees out. And so I go through the mandala, and I had a very bad fall. I tripped over not this dog, his predecessor, when I was moving equipment early in the morning in the dark for a cutting session. He used to have all these big heavy stands and wet mats. And I tripped over the dog's lead, and because they're so strong and dense, there was no give at all. So I went hurling headfirst into the edge of a concrete step right in here. And I managed to teach my class that morning, and then went to A&E. And they gave me this kind of, should we scan you or should we not? And then the A&E doctor went to the consultant and came back and said, no, you should be all right. Just, watch out. I got my friend to come and stay with me that night, so in case I had a seizure in the night, or, suddenly it got worse. But over the next 9 weeks, I kept having headaches, and then eventually I noticed that my right arm and leg were beginning to not do what I wanted to do. I couldn't reach certain key on the keyboard, just couldn't get to. And then I was in denial for about 3 days. And then I went in and they said, you've got a subdural hematoma, and it's squeezing the left side of your brain. So eventually I had surgery. They drilled 2 holes, and then they syringe out the you've heard of this one. The syringe out the stuff. And it gave me a live insight into I forget the anatomical term, but the left side of the brain is controlling the right side of the body. And so the mandala in the body, so for example, right shoulder, right arm, is controlled by the left side of the brain. So the left side of the brain is the one that's about getting, doing, thinking about things. And that's the arm. Obviously the left-handed people, it's a slightly different. Have you read the book The Master and His Emissary?
Ian McGilchrist, yeah.
So with animals, the left eye is always, the right eye is mostly with the left side of the brain. The right eye, the right side, is always looking for stuff. So predators will always come in from you remember that bit in the book? The predators will always come from this side because they know that this part is not so switched on. Whereas the left eye is scanning, is receptive. Anyway, all this kind of stuff. So the mandala in the brain, which is operating through the mandala of the body, is switched. So when I go through the mandala, for example, I start, the sequence in the Kuji-ho, the sequence starts with Bishamonten, the general of the north, who's in this side. But I close the right eye and I'm looking from the left eye, not because it's the left eye, but to get the feeling of the left side of the brain. So I name, then there's the mantra, then there's the bijam, the seed syllable. Done with the breathing, then I shift to the next one. So I go through like this, with the parts of the body, with the big gates, with the parts of the brain. And the other thing that, I find a bit, there's lots and lots about left, right, but not so much about top, bottom. So, which is the area that you deal with when you go past the midpoint in the, in the 9 stages, is you're then entering the unconscious realms. So when I'm looking at those ones, so I'm looking from the left side of the brain, but I sync the feeling in here, and then the right groin, right side of the tailbone. I go through this process. So it's very in the body, but it's also very to do with the brain. And my lot of pranayama practices, for example, if you're doing pranayama, you have these different diaphragms at the different levels, and their behavior is different. So, for example, up in the brain, when you breathe in, this draws inwards. The other ones expand. The pelvic one and the abdominal one. Inside it contracts in like this. So the brain is it has the sensations in the brain a bit like a muscle. It operates a bit like a muscle. So you feel it has a kind of tactile presence, and this is hugely helpful when you're dealing with the kind of shit that we deal with. So stuff going on in your mind, which is not important. It's a kind of circuit that you've got into the habit of getting sucked into, or obsessive thoughts, or that kind of stuff. And when you can approach the brain and feel it in terms of this like fluid and energy and moving around and relating to different parts of the body. This is what I meant earlier at the beginning, talking about opening up. Another key, a kind of a sort of insight into this was about, I can't remember now, it's so hard to, especially over COVID, trying to work out what happened when. But anyway, my mother died. My mother was at the age of 84. She was walking to the shops, and she was going past this house, this garage, and somebody reversed out, and they caught her shoe or her foot, and then they threw her back onto the back of her head. And it was such a loud bang that people a quarter of a mile away opened the window to work out what happened. So it was a huge, horrendous brain injury. But my mother was very, very tough. And so there was this, at the Radcliffe, the big hospital in Oxford, they were saying, look, she's 80, 84, really, we don't want to do brain surgery on somebody like this. But her other vital signs were so strong. They did. And my brother and I were kind of waiting. They said, oh, it'll be about a couple of hours. So, 4 hours later, when we're kind of like this, young doctor comes out and he says, oh, it went really well. And he put his hands out. He said, the brain likes it. We had to take a big chunk like that out. This is a guy who's not been properly trained about how to deal with, family members. He said, but then as we took the whole brain went really relaxed like this. Psh. And, that was a very striking image for all sorts of reasons. But, you can feel the brain like that. And after the surgery, I remember as I was, when I came out of the surgery, I was in this vast kind of like warehouse in the Royal London Hospital. Apparently they have this place for when there's a catastrophe, they have this huge place they're going to deal with all the casualties. So it was like a vast kind of cathedral. And as I was coming out, I had this kind of vision of the Shumisen, which is Mount Sumeru, the mountain at the center of the Buddhist universe. And I was kind of on the top of it, and I was looking down, and the dragons, the locus of the dragons, there's what's called the dragon ball, I call the dragon egg. It's a very potent kind of myth in different places. And I could see these different colored balls, and I was on the top of this mountain. And then this Tibetan guy appeared. So I said to the guy, for whatever reason, I said, "You must be from Milarepa's Valley." He said, "Yes, how did you know that?" And this was the guy from the ICU unit who was a Tibetan from the valley of Milarepa.
Really?
Yeah. And then somebody explained to me afterwards that the French anesthetist was famous for her mixes. But that didn't explain the Tibetan guy actually showing up. But there you go. So that was kind of part of the sort of input, input to this exploration of, the different parts of the brain. And following the surgery, you get a lot of air bubbles in the brain, and it interferes with the sacrospinal fluid. Yes. So I could feel all this stuff moving around inside. And when it really moved, there'd be a kind of like a gluk, 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 gluk sound, which initially I thought was just me hearing it. And then I did it once with my wife, Karen, and she heard it from the other side of the room, which was quite alarming. So we went back to I went back to the hospital and got readmitted for 3 days because I was convinced that they'd messed up the surgery. But it wasn't. It was just this, stuff going on. And because of all the things I've done, I was just much more switched on to what was going on, and more, in this case, anxious about what might have happened. Yeah.
Some people, talking about Kundalini and central channel and that sort of thing, some people do associate that with the cerebrospinal fluid and creating internal pressures and moving it in different sorts of ways. Did you experiment, given that you had this stuff happening with your cerebrospinal fluid? Did you attempt to use certain practices to see what would happen?
No, I was much too scared. I just wanted it to get better. I mean, I was doing the mudras at the time as a way of, because one hand had stopped working, so I was doing those, but the focus was all the time on just stabilizing. And when you've had, I don't know other kinds of operations, but when you've had this kind of surgery, it's important that you stay quiet. They said for 9 weeks, 8-9 weeks, because the brain's been traumatized. And if you stimulate it excessively, you can get a seizure. And if you do get a seizure, it can then become a kind of thing for the rest of your life. You're going to be dealing with seizures. So I think 3 weeks after the surgery, I was watching something exciting on the TV and getting a bit excited about the kinds of training I might do, or beginning to kind of. And then I got this visual distortion. So then I got very scared, and I concentrated even more on being quiet and stable and relaxed. But over time, because you kind of enter somewhere inside yourself, you're made to realize that there is this possibility, there is this kind of realm where these sorts of phenomena are, which you can actually perceive. Definitely, I've become more aware of that. The best explanation is in Shandor's second book, which I helped edit. There's a thing called the Dharantra. Anyway, it's a kind of waterfall inside. It's a kind of waterfall inside it, which moves in two directions. There's an image of it would be very good if I can remember the details of this. Anyway, there's an image. So there's an archer who has to shoot by looking into a pool up above him. I think it's in the story of the Mahabharata. It's about Arjuna, I think, who's shooting upwards. So your attention is down into the pool, and then there's this thing going up, and there's this communication. And it's the problem. I mean, I've had lots of people over the years who've claimed to have Kundalini experiences, and usually it's like a kind of super excitement, or like a short circuit. And all the experiences, well, I say all the experiences, I mean, there are quite a few over the many decades, that when that thing is strongest, it manifests as a kind of a steadiness, so steady. Which of course is what Fudo is, the unmoving, shining king. So it's the kind of incarnation of that principle. Yeah. There's a poem which includes every phonetic sound in the Japanese alphabet, and which was considered at one time to have been written by Kukai. So obviously you've heard of Kukai. Kukai means the sea of void, which was the name of the founder of the Shingon sect in Japan. And very loosely, the poem says, life is beautiful, but it's fading like it's a very evocative and kind of ambiguous. So it suggests cherry blossom, it suggests the bloom of the complexion of a very young, beautiful woman, and how that's being lost, or how that's, that's fading. That's the first half. And in the second half, it says, go into the deep mountains, do not get drunk. And so the first half conveys the essence of Japanese culture as it is popularly known. The second half conveys the side of Japanese culture which perhaps has been only experienced by a few people, but which is contained deep within the mountain religion, Zen, all these, the deep spirituality of Japan, which is, you go into the place of the void, of the, where you experience this effulgence, bright light, or spectacular, thunderous sound reverberating. And the important thing is to stay steady with it. And, with the sword, if you don't do that, you can get, if you get really skillful with the sword and then you're doing a demonstration in front of thousands of people and the energy starts moving, you cannot indulge, because the moment you indulge, oops, and I've had a few of those experiences. So it kind of keeps you back on the center. Yeah.
That's very fascinating indeed. To be honest with you, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the things I'd like to ask you about. We've gone in a very unexpected, at least I didn't expect it, direction, but it's been so fascinating nonetheless. So I'm wondering, I might petition you for a sequel. Some of the themes that I'd like to explore, and you've touched on them, you've hinted on them, is the body, the role of the body, the role of conditioning, and one's relationship to one's body in general, and the sorts of things you're talking about. You've hinted on a few of those things. For example, carrying extra weight as being a blockage, potentially. And you've talked about the body opening and closing. And you've talked about inside versus outside, that sort of thing. That's something I'd like to ask you about. Also, your own biography. Very fascinating indeed, going to Japan in 1981 and all the things that happened after then. We've touched on some of your biography, but I'd like to go back to the beginning. And your various teachers, Fushi Sensei, Nakamura.
Well, I'm very happy the way it's gone, because I'm very used to saying that other stuff,
Yeah.
And
why do you think we didn't do that this time?
Well, maybe because there's a certain kind of pressure within me for the things that are coming, that are coming out now, that are more interesting than, because when you look back, the significance of events changes. The idea that when I was doing lots and lots of work on Patanjali, I memorized all the Yoga Sutras when I was in my 20s.
Gosh.
You recite them every day.
In Sanskrit?
Yeah.
Wow.
And try to, in order to really grasp, does this actually apply to what actually you're living in, how you're thinking? And you have this sort of conundrum that you've got the Purusha and the Prakriti. You're familiar with these terms, yeah?
Yes.
The Purusha principle of seeing, what's sometimes seen as the soul, and then you have the matrix, the world of phenomena. And then they're together, but they need to be separate, or are they separate and they need to be together? What's going on? And it really is very difficult for the mind to grasp. I mean, obviously that's partly the point, because that part of your mind can't. It's only the deep mind that can understand it. But to put it really simply, when I was 11, my father died, and I had a very strange reaction to it. Well, obsessive reaction to it, that I thought it was that there was something about this experience that was trying to teach me something. And I kind of developed like a ritual, which I do every night. And my father used to do lots of DIY stuff, and he had a big vise, a vise for carpentry. And so the vise must have weighed about, I don't know, 5-6 kilograms. And I was just 11. And I'd lie on my back, and I'd have the vise on the ground behind me like this, and I'd take it slowly over down to my abdomen, back again. I used to do this 100 times. And every time it passed over my head, I thought, you're facing death now. If you let go, you'd be where your father is. It's a pretty bizarre kind of thing to do. It kind of something that represented my father, and then having been exposed at the age of 10 to the presence of death. And it kind of set me up for what I did and for what I've been doing ever since. Because the first time, which I describe in the introduction to the book, when Fushi gave me the sword and I did this movement, and his breath was taken away, because he said, as he described, my body was a bag of shit. I was stiff and heavy. But when I did this movement, it was amazing, because I'd been doing this practice for it. But it had also meant develop my shoulders in a way which is, I think, why I got the back problem. Because I wasn't connecting properly to my legs doing the weight training exercises. And even when I was 30, at some tournament in Japan, 32, 33, I was asked to do a special demonstration by Nakamura Sensei. So I'm doing it, and I was pretty big in those days, but very fast. And I could hear these people say, "Whoa, look, that gaijin is very good, isn't he?" Blah blah blah. But I knew it wasn't connecting down here. I knew I'd have a back pain shortly after, and in a few months' time when we're back on the floor. So this thing connected me with the sword, but it's taken me 40 years. It's taken me 40 years to be able to, properly connect it with here, so I'm not overusing the shoulders and damaging the back, and spend most of the day looking as if I'm some sort of and in a way that's a kind of image of the universe. So you've got this thing inside people where they know somehow there's this thing they ought to connect with, but there's so many things in the way, so they have to undergo that journey. And in my case, in a very sort of prosaic and kind of pedestrian way, that's exactly what I've been dealing with. But if you didn't have that, if there wasn't that journey to undertake, if for example, like sometimes I get students who come and you just look at them, the way they move, nothing stands out. They're just so smooth, coordinated, at ease. Why would you then spend hours and hours a day doing stuff if in that state? Yeah. So, I could talk about, I did this in 19 blah, 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 and I did this in blah, blah, blah. But really, that is the story, And the rest has been kind of not inconsequential. Obviously, it's not inconsequential, but that's the kind of the basic narrative. Yeah.
It's been wonderful. Thank you. It's such a fascinating discussion. I very much look forward to the sequel.
Well, perhaps next time I would quite like to ask you a bit more. It would be interesting for me to, to know where you're coming from, and basically I've talked about what I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, good.
John Maki Evans, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.